first year I came to George West. It was whenever Finley had that accident and broke his leg. Whenever that was, that's when they invited me. And I said, well, sure, I'll come down there. And the very first place they sent me on that Friday for school was the school that Finley had been to the year before. And the children was staring up at me. And they knew right away I wasn't Finley because I didn't have that big old long black coat on that he always wore. And I didn't have a big old long head of hair. And one little boy in the very front row said, are you going to tell us what happened to the fox? And I said, what are you talking about? Well, the guy that was here last time said he'd be back next year and tell us about this fox in the river. I said, let me check my bag with all my stories. And I said, I ain't got nothing with a fox. I'm starting to get scared. And I said, well, I'll tell you this one instead. And I went on with the show. The very next year, Finley was back, and I said, hey, man, I filled in for you. You need to tell me what happened to that fox in the river. And he said, oh, man, I had about 30 seconds left before they kicked me out, and I just started making something up, and I don't even know what the rest of that story is. I said, thanks a lot. George West is... You've heard a lot of good stories about George West and about the people and the storytellers that come here, and I'll share a couple with you as well. But I don't want you to go away thinking that the whole thing is roses and champagne, because it's a lot of work being a storyteller. I tell you what, you might find out that you're going to be in Pettus telling stories to 75 kids, which makes up the entire school. You might find yourself in Pawnee, where it's 45 in the entire school, or you might be super lucky like I was the first year, and I wound up in Tilden, Texas, McMullen County Schools, and I had the entire kindergarten class in my first session, the entire kindergarten class. If you can imagine those little eyeballs staring at you, 10 of them right there on the ground in the library. I wanted to get off on the right foot, it being my first time and all, and so I pulled myself up as tall as I could go, and I said, how many of y'all are from Texas? And every hand went up on those 10 kids except for one boy at the end. I walked down to where he was, and I said, what's your name, son? He said, Tucker. I said, Tucker, that's a good, strong name. You ain't from Texas? He said, no, sir. I said, well, where are you from? He said, I'm from Callahan. Now, some of y'all are laughing because you know Callahan's about 2.5 miles from where we were sitting. But by golly, he wasn't from Texas. He is from Callahan. And I tried to go on with my story from there. This little boy down on this end had his hand still up from my original question. Now, I was that boy in school, and I should have known better. But I was new and young, and I walked right down to him. I said, are you from Texas? He said, I'm from Texas now. I said, now? He said, yeah, I'm from Alabama. I said, oh, Alabama, I love Alabama. They have the best roadside parks of any state. It's a beautiful state to drive through. He said, And we lived in Alabama, and my daddy had a girlfriend, and my mama didn't like that. So we had to move. Now the kindergarten teachers are in the back of the room, you know. Whenever there's a guest speaker, you know, they're in relaxation mode. They perked up when he said that. I said, well, what does your daddy do? He's in the prison. Wait, he's in the prison? Oh, but he comes home every day. Mama says I have to say he comes home every day. It's not all roses and champagne being a storyteller out here at George West. One of the years, not long after that, they didn't get any bad reports on me, so they kept asking me back. And I think it might have been Becky, but it might have been Mary Martin. She was experimenting with the program a bit. instead of just doing schools on Friday, she sent me down to the Shady Acres down here on 281, that old folks home down there. Yeah. I guess because on my resume it does say that I won the least forgettable performer in 2006 at the Trembling Hills Friends and Fish Cook-Off. So she felt obliged to send me down there to Shady Acres, and my wife comes in with me, and that's a fine show. We get in there's nobody in the room at all, so we're thinking this is not going to work out. Pretty soon here comes the Blue Rinse Brigade right in through the doors. And we're at this center table, and these two ladies come in, and they sit down on this side, and then another lady comes in and sits right down at the same table where we're at, just right there. Now, I don't know if any of y'all might be preachers out there. My daddy was a preacher, and he would tell you that no one ever sits on the front row. So I was immediately scared with this woman sitting right here, but I began to tell a story. And these two women over here on this side, one of them couldn't hear at all. And so her friend was giving her the hearing impaired translation. He said there was a fox down by the river. Oh. We got through that first stanza. And she's repeating everything I say to her friend there. And I got on to the second part of that story, and the woman sitting right here said, that reminds me of a story my son told when he came home from college the other day. I think it was 1956 when he brought this story home, and I'm telling you all this story. These two ladies weren't having any of that. This one over here, who was previously hard of hearing, said, you need to shut up, Maybelle. We're here to hear him, not you.
I told when he was 18 months old, but this is the oldest.
And there was an old man in the back, in a wheelchair, with his Vietnam hat on. And I did my best to get through that entire performance, and when we were ushered off the stage by the helpers there, we went through and shook hands, and it was pre-COVID, you know, we could still do that. We shook hands, and we got back to that old man in that wheelchair, and he practically stood up from that chair, and he reached out his hand, shook, and he said, son, that was a fine set of stories. Then he plopped back down in that chair, and the lady who was helping him, she was just amazed. She said, he's been here 5 years. He ain't said a word to no one. So it's not all roses and champagne for sure, but there's breakfast tacos. And sometimes you wind up in a place where they really know what a story's good for. Coming down to George West, we marked it on our calendars every single year. We wait to hear from whoever was in charge to invite us down. I didn't get to work with Rob, but I got to work with Becky. I got to work with Mary Margaret, seeing all the storytellers. And then Dobie Deachos came along. I got a crazy phone call from a guy, and he said, hey, we're doing this thing. I said, sounds great. Anytime you're coming down the highway, you're heading somewhere, you see Live Oak County on that sign. You just think, I'm coming to a place that knows stories and appreciates stories. Even from a guy like me, perennial second place in the Liars Contest. I'm just, look at it, instead of thinking second place, I always just think of it as, I gave them all something to shoot for. And improve themselves against the wet, hard stone, right? And I don't want you feeling bad for me. I've certainly won other contests where DC and Donna have never been invited. Or that little kid from Mary Ann's class. She didn't even mention, nobody said there was children telling stories here at George West too, and trust me, just like in the movies, you don't want to follow a child or an animal. On a storytelling stage, you do not want to follow young Ben in his snap rim hat. It was his very first Liars contest, and I went up there to wish him good luck like people had done for me, and hope he did a good job. And he said, "Old man, you're going down." 12 years old, in like a Sinatra hat. I figured he'd have a couple of big old suit-wearing goons behind him. He said, "Old man, you're going down." I believe that boy's in college now, right? I told Mark earlier we had to walk all the way over there for a photo. They didn't know we were old people. We needed that photo stage a little closer. I said, "I'll be 60 in a couple of years." He said, "I remember being 60. I said, "How long ago was that?" He said, "I don't want to say." I said, "Well, how long were you 60? He said, "An entire year." I said, "Oh, no, I'm not going to be able to put up with it." But I've had a fantastic time out here, George West, after all these years. And there's just no place like it. And no place like the people that are here and appreciating stories. So I should just tell Mark to come up here. Or you want to come up here? He's got some years on me, maybe. And Rob started the whole mess, right? Yeah, he did. And he's still around. Was that beard as white back then? Not quite. Not quite. That's so many years of working with Finley Stewart. That's what that is. Well, thanks very much for having me out. Thank you. Fantastic.